More than 2 decades has now passed since the fateful day of 9/11, and yet questions linger and the official explanations remain far from satisfying.
The World Trade Center is located in the financial district of Lower Manhattan, New York City. This is the view of the World Trade Center complex today. This is where the old-time and famous Twin Towers were located. The Twin Towers were the world's tallest building from 1971 to 1973.
If planes really did hit the Twin Towers as we were told, how did they collapse in the way they did? And why is there so much controversy, confusion, and suspicion around what happened that day? Why do so many people believe it may have been an inside job? Well, to understand this, we have to start with the basic facts and build from there. The Twin Towers were an engineering marvel, designed to withstand extreme conditions, including the impact of commercial airliners. The towers had a unique structural design. They were constructed with a core of 47 massive steel columns surrounded by an exterior tube of steel columns that gave the buildings both strength and flexibility. The core housed elevator shafts, stairwells, and utility spaces, and it was the main support system for these towers. This design was supposed to make them resilient against any catastrophic events, including fires. Well, let's look at this. We look at how the buildings collapsed on 9/11. The first question that arises is, if the plane struck the upper floors, leaving the lower sections untouched, why did the entire structure come down so uniformly? The lower floors were designed to hold up the entire structure above them, acting as a support system. Shouldn't they have withstood the impact and collapse of the top floors?
Let's go back to before 9/11 attack. The whole World Trade Center complex looked very different compared to today's. This was Building 7, Building 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, and 1, also known as Twin Towers. Under the ground, there was a layer of slurry wall around this complex. It was used to prevent water from the Hudson River going through the soil and flood the construction site. There were 6 levels of floors under the ground. The foundation of the Twin Towers went 70 foot deep down to the bedrock. This is the core of the building, running from the bedrock to the top of the building. The core contains 47 steel columns. Let's take a look inside the core. It has restroom, utility rooms, a lot of elevators, but only 3 emergency stairwells. This is the exterior steel column of the buildings. This is a floor system. It was made of lightweight steel and concrete. All of these parts held the building together in place. The Twin Towers are said to withstand earthquake and hurricane wind power.
You would think so, right? The official narrative provided by the government in the 9/11 Commission reports blames the intense fires from the jet fuel for weakening the steel beams, causing a pancake collapse.
NORAD and the FAA were unprepared for the type of attacks launched against the United States on September 11, 2001. They struggled under difficult circumstances to improvise a homeland defense against an unprecedented challenge they had never encountered and had never trained to meet.
But let's break this down. Jet fuel burns at a maximum temperature of around 980 to 1500 degrees Fahrenheit. Steel melts at approximately 2500 degrees Fahrenheit and loses about 50% of its strength at 1100 degrees. However, if the steel weakened due to the fire, it doesn't explain the complete symmetrical collapse of the buildings. Think about it. How does it fall straight down if the bottom steel columns weren't affected?
767 heading toward the World Trade Center.
If the fires were mostly concentrated at the top, why would the bottom floors, which were untouched and designed to be the strongest, fail in such a manner? Moreover, the top of the towers would have been lighter after the planes hit, not heavier, because a significant amount of the building's material had already been displaced and burned. Logistically, this should have made it less likely for the remaining structure to collapse all of the way down, not more likely. We have the controlled demolition evidence. Here's where it gets even more puzzling. The collapse of both towers and later Building 7, which wasn't even hit by a plane, was almost perfect, resembling a controlled demolition. Think about that for a moment. Buildings that collapse due to structural failure typically lean, twist, or break apart. They do not fall straight down into the footprint at free fall acceleration. The speed and symmetry which the towers fell essentially into their own footprint suggests something much more deliberate. Experts in controlled demolitions have pointed out that the manner in which the towers fell bore all the hallmarks of planned events. The free fall acceleration observed during the collapse, where parts of the buildings fell at the rate of gravity, indicates that something other than just a fire and impact was at play that day. In a controlled demolition, explosives are used to bring down a structure in a precise and predictable manner. The fact the Twin Towers in the Building 7 fell in such a similar fashion raises serious questions about whether explosives may have been used to facilitate the collapse of the towers.
This actually is a piece of copper that is part of a shaped charge weapon. And what happens is you put a little explosive in each one of these little pockets and you set off the charge, and this whole rim implodes and you get a stream of liquid copper, and this jet of copper will cut through steel.
Now, personnel clear, and the demolition team places copper-shaped charges on all 24 support columns.
Now, this is a linear shaped charge, and it's wired in with the dynamite. When it cuts, it'll cut this column right on this angle.
Buried in this pile of debris should be hard evidence pointing to implosion. Evidence that should have been found in the rubble of the World Trade Center. The search begins.
Here's a piece right here, that blew away. Here's a whole rat's nest that's still tied into the building. You can't remove all of this stuff.
Building 7 and the silence around it is a major issue. Let's not forget about the World Trade Center Building 7, which collapsed later that day. The 47-story building wasn't hit by a plane, yet it fell in a manner that looked exactly like a controlled demolition. The official explanation is that fires caused by the debris from the collapse of the Twin Towers led to its downfall. However, Building 7 fell straight down in under 7 seconds, and for a portion of its collapse, it was in free fall. This means that for those few seconds, the structure was offering no resistance whatsoever, something that can't be explained simply by fire. Adding to the mystery, many people aren't even aware that Building 7 fell on 9/11 because it was barely covered by the media. Why would the collapse of a 47-story skyscraper in the middle of New York City not be major news coverage? And why did the 9/11 Commission choose to avoid a detailed investigation into Building 7's collapse? It's almost like they knew something was up. And then we have the suspicious stock trades right before 9/11.
While many people continue to believe that 9/11 was a terrorist attack perpetrated by 19 box cutter wielding hijackers, it was more likely executed by very sophisticated, highly intelligent international agents who meant the attack as a cover-up for financial crimes being investigated by the Office of Naval Intelligence, or ONI, whose offices in the Pentagon were destroyed on that same day. The attacks were intended to cover up the clearing of $240 billion in securities covertly created in September 1991 to fund a covert economic war against the Soviet Union, during which unknown Western investors bought up much of the Soviet industry with a focus on oil and gas. The 9/11 attacks also served to derail multiple federal investigations of crimes associated with the 1991 covert operation. Hundreds of billions of dollars of government securities had to be destroyed. A critical mass of brokers from the major government security brokerages in the Twin Towers had to be eliminated to create chaos in the government securities market. A situation needed to be created wherein $240 billion of covert securities could be electronically cleared without anyone asking questions, which actually happened when the Federal Reserve declared an emergency and invoked its emergency powers that very afternoon. There were 3 major securities brokers in the World Trade Center: Cantor Fitzgerald, Eurobrokers, and Garvin Intercapital. Cantor Fitzgerald was the largest securities dealer in the United States and arguably the primary target. 41.
So let's step back and look at the bigger picture. In the days leading up to 9/11, there were unusual spikes in stock trades. Specifically, there was a significant increase in put options on American Airlines and United Airlines stocks, which are essentially bets that the stock price will fall. These trades were made by entities with connections to intelligence communities, suggesting that some individuals might have had prior knowledge of the attacks.
On that fateful day, the Securities and Exchange Commission declared a national emergency for the first time in U.S. history, invoking its emergency powers under Securities Exchange Act Section 12K, easing regulatory restrictions for clearing and settling security trades for the next 15 days. These changes would allow an estimated $240 billion in covert government securities to be cleared upon maturity without the standard regulatory controls around identification of ownership.
Despite an investigation by the SEC, The details of these trades and the individuals involved were never fully disclosed, of course, to the public. And why? If these trades were innocent, why the secrecy? And if they weren't, who knows about the attacks in advance? And shouldn't we get to know who they are? Why did they not stop these people? But moving on to government agencies and possible cover-ups, there are more unsettling questions we need to consider the actions of government agencies and the handling of evidence. Key evidence from the Twin Towers, including the steel beams, was quickly removed and recycled within weeks of the attacks. Remember that. Preventing a thorough forensic analysis. This is not a standard procedure in an investigation of this magnitude. Usually, the scene of the disaster is preserved for as long as possible to allow investigators to thoroughly examine what happened. Furthermore, the 9/11 Commission, tasked with investigating the attacks, has been criticized for its lack of transparency and thoroughness. There were significant gaps in the evidence they reviewed, and many people believe that the Commission was more interested in protecting certain interests than uncovering the full truth for the American people. For instance, testimonies from firefighters and other first responders who reported hearing explosions in the building were largely ignored or downplayed. And then, the Pentagon attack in Flight 77. The story doesn't end with the Twin Towers. The attack on the Pentagon and events surrounding Flight 77 are equally perplexing. Some argue that the damage to the Pentagon does not match the impact of a large commercial jet. The size of the impact hole and the minimal debris found at the scene led to speculation that something else might have occurred there. Eyewitnesses reported seeing something much smaller than a commercial airliner, and crucial security footage from nearby cameras was never released in full. Why the lack of transparency? If the official story is accurate, wouldn't releasing all the footage put to rest any doubts about what happened that day? It's because they know they're hiding something. They have interest to keep held back. And then moving on to the anthrax attacks, a forgotten chapter shortly after 9/11. Another wave of terror struck the United States. This time in the form of an anthrax attack. Letters containing anthrax spores were sent to various media outlets and senators, killing 5 people and infecting 17 others. Initially, these attacks were linked to Al-Qaeda in Iraq, further fueling the push for the war on terror.
Email from Nebraska. Will you discuss the current status of Judicial Watch's lawsuit regarding Vice President Cheney's staff receiving anthrax shots before the October outbreak?
Well, this is another good example of how certain people consider themselves to be above the rest of us. On September 11th, I think it'll come as a shock to a lot of people, but it's been reported by the New York Times and other major news organizations and confirmed by the White House. The President's office and Vice President's office went on Cipro, the antibiotic that was used to combat anthrax when it was undertaken. We represent the postal workers here in Washington, D.C., and several throughout the country, hundreds of them, who contracted anthrax by virtue of the terrorist attacks. The White House went on Cipro. It must have known that either an attack was underway or was imminent. Yet other individuals, such as the postal workers, weren't given anthrax for several weeks, not even after the Senate got attacked by anthrax, and Senator Daschle's staff and all of his aides, including himself, they went on antibiotics.
War on terror. However, it was later revealed that the anthrax used in the attacks came from a U.S. military lab. This raises disturbing questions. Was the anthrax attack a coordinated part of the 9/11 plan to manipulate public opinion and government policy? Why were these attacks quickly blamed on foreign enemies when the evidence pointed elsewhere? This is another instance where the official narrative crumbles under scrutiny.
Most people, by the way, Kim, forget that the anthrax scare of September 2001 was the real domestic terrorism event of 2001. We talk about 9/11. We don't talk about 9/28, and we should. We should be talking about the anthrax scare because that's when the Department of Defense actually attacked the American people and killed American citizens with a bioweapon called anthrax. That's a terrible thing, and we don't ever talk about it. But what came to our attention in the spring of 2001, so this was months before the anthrax alleged outbreak, was a purchase order by the Department of Defense for 300 million doses of ciprofloxacin. Now, Kim, most people don't know, but Cipro was the drug that you use to treat anthrax poisoning. Now, anthrax, as a practical matter, is a disease that affects hide tanners. You heard what I said, hide tanners, like people who work with leather.
Right.
Now, I don't know in what universe we were expecting 300 million people to be suddenly tanning hides in the great buffalo hunt of 2001.
Harbor.
Like, what?
The concept of a new Pearl Harbor is also significant when examining the events of 9/11. In the years leading up to the attack, several influential neoconservatives within the U.S. government had advocated for a transformative event, a new Pearl Harbor, that would galvanize the American public and justify an aggressive foreign policy move. 9/11 occurred. It provided a perfect pretext for a series of sweeping changes: the Patriot Act, the invasion of Afghanistan, the war in Iraq, and an unprecedented expansion of government surveillance and control. Could it be that 9/11 was the new Pearl Harbor that some officials had envisioned? Were these events of that day used to push an agenda that had been planned long before that? And what does all of this mean in the end? The inconsistencies, the destruction of evidence, the rapid removal of debris, the uninvestigated stock trades, the free fall collapse of Building 7, the strange behavior surrounding the Pentagon attacks, and the immediate anthrax scare all point to a narrative that is full of holes. We're not talking about random coincidences here, or even minor errors in judgment. We're looking at a series of events and actions that suggest something much darker and more orchestrated. This was planned. Many questions remain unanswered, and many of the answers have been given do not add up. If 9/11 was indeed an inside job or an element of international complacency, the implications are profound. It suggests that those in power were willing to sacrifice thousands of lives to achieve a geopolitical and domestic agenda. It implies a level of deceit and manipulation that is hard to fathom. The need for continued investigations is here, and we need to push for it. We owe it to ourselves and future generations to keep asking these questions and seeking the truth. The official story about 9/11 does not stand up to scrutiny.